The wind cut through the small town like a sharp knife that evening, carrying the chill of the approaching winter straight into every corner of the neighborhood. Snow had begun to fall earlier in the day, dusting rooftops and empty streets with a soft, white layer. The protagonist, a man in his late 30s who had lived in the town all his life, sat by the window with a steaming mug of coffee, watching the snowflakes drift lazily down. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. Most people had already gone inside to escape the cold, and the streets looked abandoned except for the occasional car passing by, leaving a trail of gray slush behind it. He had always known his neighbors, but there was one who remained an enigma, a woman who lived 2 houses down. She was an Apache widow, elderly, and deeply proud. Her husband had passed many years ago, and ever since, she had lived alone in a modest, weathered house, with a small porch and a garden that no longer bore flowers. She rarely spoke to anyone, and most of the townspeople respected her privacy. Occasionally, she would wave politely, but she seemed determined to live in her own world, shaped by memories, solitude, and the traditions she carried from her heritage. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed something unusual. A faint light flickered in her yard. It wasn't steady. It seemed to dance like a candle, struggling against the wind. That was strange because she usually kept her lights off at night. His curiosity grew, mixed with a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. Instinctively, he grabbed his coat, stepped into the snow, and started walking toward her house. The wind bit at his cheeks, and the cold seeped through his gloves, but he pushed forward. The closer he got, the more he realized that the flickering light wasn't coming from inside the house, it was coming from her porch. When he reached her yard, the sight that met his eyes made his heart tighten. She was sitting on the edge of the porch steps, wrapped in a thin shawl that did little against the harsh wind. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably, and her breath came out in short, misty gasps. Her eyes, wide with fear and confusion, met his, and he could see the deep lines etched into her face from years of hardship and loneliness. It was clear that she had been outside for a long time, struggling to stay warm, and now her body was failing under the icy grip of winter. "Misus Yazi," he called softly, using the name he had learned from casual conversations in town. "It's me. Come inside, please." She tried to respond, but her lips barely moved, and only a faint whisper emerged. Her pride was evident even in this vulnerable state. She wanted to insist that she was fine, that she could handle the cold, but her body refused to cooperate. Hypothermia had already begun to take its toll, and he knew that if he didn't act quickly, the consequences could be severe. He approached carefully, not wanting to frighten her further. "It's cold out here. You shouldn't be sitting in the snow," he said gently. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded slightly, her strength barely enough to lift herself from the steps. He held her steady, supporting her frail frame as they walked to the front door. Her house smelled faintly of sage and wood smoke, a comforting scent that reminded him of simpler times. He guided her inside, wrapping her in a thick blanket he had grabbed from his own coat pocket. She sank into an armchair near the fireplace, shivering violently, and he could see the color had drained from her cheeks. He set a cup of hot tea in front of her, hoping it would help warm her from the inside out. She clutched it with both hands, but her fingers were stiff and uncooperative. He could tell she wanted to protest, to say she didn't need help, but he ignored the pride in her eyes and focused on the urgency of the situation. "You scared me," he said softly. She remained silent for a few moments, staring into the fire as if it held answers she wasn't ready to see. Slowly, she whispered, I didn't mean to. I thought I could manage." Her voice was weak, almost broken, but it carried a lifetime of resilience and self-reliance. The protagonist realized that what had brought her outside tonight was likely a combination of loneliness, stubbornness, and perhaps a misjudgment of the weather. Many in town knew her as strong-willed, but tonight, that same strength had nearly put her in danger. He stayed by her side, wrapping another blanket around her shoulders. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said gently. "It's okay to accept help sometimes." Her eyes met his, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small, grateful smile. It was a fragile smile, one that hinted at relief and recognition that someone cared enough to step in when it mattered most. As the evening progressed, the wind outside howled, rattling the windows and pushing the cold into every corner of the room. She sipped her tea quietly, the warmth slowly returning to her body. He could see the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the flickering firelight, he felt a connection that went beyond mere neighborly concern. It was a reminder of the simple, often overlooked truth that human life is delicate, and moments of compassion can leave a lasting impact. He asked gently about her day, hoping to keep her engaged. She began to share small fragments of her life, stories of her late husband, memories of family gatherings, the harsh winters she had survived, and the traditions she had preserved. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, and he listened intently, realizing that beneath the pride and solitude was a wealth of experience, wisdom, and resilience. By the time the night had fully settled, the snow had stopped, leaving a quiet blanket over the world outside. He suggested that she stay indoors for the night, if only for safety. But she hesitated. Her pride was still strong, and he could see the struggle in her eyes. "Just for tonight," he added softly. "Tomorrow, you can return to your routine." Finally, after a long pause, she nodded, accepting his offer. It was a small victory, but one that meant everything in that moment. The protagonist felt a quiet sense of relief. He had intervened just in time, and she was safe for now. As he stepped outside to check on the firewood and make sure everything was secure, he looked back at her sitting quietly by the fire. There was a serene dignity in the way she held herself, even after such a frightening experience. It struck him that life often tested people in unexpected ways, and sometimes it took the simplest acts of kindness to make the difference between danger and safety. The night was far from over, and the cold would not relent. But for now, in that small, quiet house, two lives had intersected in a moment of shared humanity. One had reached out to save, and the other had allowed herself to be saved. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, warmth could be found not just from fire or blankets, but from the simple act of caring for another human being. And in that moment, the protagonist knew that this night would be remembered not for the cold or the danger, but for the fragile, growing trust between neighbors who had, until now, existed in parallel worlds. The fire crackled softly in the living room, sending small sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the wind had not yet calmed, and the temperature continued to drop. The protagonist kept glancing at the window, noticing the frost slowly creeping across the glass. It was a harsh winter night, one that could turn dangerous quickly if the right precautions weren't taken. He looked back at the neighbor, who was still wrapped tightly in blankets, sipping her tea with trembling hands. Even inside, the chill lingered, seeping into the corners of the house. He realized that keeping her safe for just the night might not be enough. She was older, fragile, and her body had already shown signs of struggle. And yet, she sat quietly, as if silently judging the intrusion of another into her carefully guarded life. There was pride in her posture, a kind of dignity that refused to bow even to the harshest of winters. "Do you want some more tea?" he asked gently, trying not to alarm her. She hesitated, glancing at him, as if unsure whether to accept such a simple offer. "Yes, thank you," she finally murmured. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight of experience, of someone who had lived through hardship and learned to endure in silence. He poured the tea slowly, watching her hands as they wrapped around the warm cup. He could see the veins standing out beneath her thin skin and the stiffness in her fingers from the cold. Every movement was careful, deliberate. And it made him realize just how precarious her situation had been before he found her. "Did you go outside on purpose?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. He didn't want to offend her, but he needed to understand why she had been sitting in the cold for so long. She paused, looking into the fire as if searching for the right words. I wanted to check the porch light. It was flickering, and I thought maybe it needed fixing," she said finally. Her words were quiet, almost apologetic, but he sensed there was more behind them. Perhaps it was loneliness, a desire to feel useful, or simply the stubbornness that came from years of living independently. He nodded slowly. "I see. It's just that you could have been seriously hurt. The cold tonight is dangerous, especially for anyone who's alone." Her eyes softened, but she remained quiet. There was no argument, only the faintest acknowledgement that he was right. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and he felt grateful that she had allowed him to see it. To help her regain some warmth, he moved to the small kitchen and grabbed another blanket, draping it gently over her shoulders. "We'll get you warmed up," he said, more to himself than to her. He noticed that she did not protest, which was unusual. Normally, she would have insisted that she could manage on her own. But tonight, the exhaustion and cold had overridden her pride. She wrapped herself tighter in the blankets, finally relaxing into the chair. The fire's warmth slowly began to take effect, and the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. He could see the relief in her eyes, mixed with a lingering hesitation. She was still wary, still cautious of this sudden intrusion into her life. "Tell me about your husband," he said after a moment, unsure why the words had come out, but sensing that she might want to speak. Her eyes flickered with surprise, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Then, slowly, she began to speak. Her voice was soft, but steady, carrying the weight of memories long held close. She talked about him with quiet affection, describing small, everyday moments that now seemed precious. How he would chop wood for the fire. How he always insisted on keeping the porch light burning. How he loved tending the small garden in the summer. The protagonist listened intently, realizing that these stories were more than just memories. They were pieces of her life that defined her, that shaped the woman she had become. The fire crackled between them, filling the room with warmth and sound, and for the first time that evening, there was a sense of calm. As she spoke, he could see the lines on her face soften, and her hands began to move more freely. There was still a hint of trembling, but it was less severe. The tea had helped, the blankets had helped. But more than anything, it seemed that talking about her husband and her life had given her a small measure of comfort. "You've been alone for a long time," he said gently, careful not to sound judgmental. "It must be hard." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it is. But it's my life. I've learned to manage. I have memories, traditions. They keep me company." Her voice was quiet but firm. There was pride in her words, the kind of pride that came from surviving and enduring despite life's hardships. He nodded, understanding her need for independence, but also aware that tonight had proven just how fragile that independence could be. He sat quietly, letting her words hang in the air, feeling a sense of connection growing between them. After a while, he realized that she needed more than just warmth and tea. She needed reassurance, someone to stay with her, even if just for the night. He hesitated, unsure how to suggest it without offending her, but the urgency of the situation left him little choice. "I think it might be safer if you stay here tonight," he said carefully. "Just for tonight. We can figure out the rest tomorrow." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of reluctance. "You're not a burden," he replied firmly. "Tonight, it's about staying safe. That's all. Tomorrow, you can go back to your home, and everything will be fine. But tonight, Please. There was a long pause. He watched her, sensing the internal struggle she faced between pride and survival. Finally, she nodded slightly, allowing herself to accept his offer. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. As she settled more comfortably in the chair, he moved around the room, checking that everything she might need was within reach. A small tray of snacks, more blankets, and a few hot water bottles were arranged near her. She didn't say much, but her expression softened, a quiet acknowledgement that she was no longer alone. The protagonist took a moment to reflect. He had always known this neighbor from afar, had waved and exchanged brief greetings over the years, but tonight had revealed a different side of her. A woman of resilience, pride, and deep vulnerability. He felt a sense of responsibility, but also a quiet gratitude for the trust she had placed in him. As the night deepened, they continued to talk. She shared stories of her childhood, her family, and the lessons her parents had taught her. He listened with rapt attention, fascinated by her experiences and the quiet strength that had carried her through life. In return, he shared small snippets of his own life, creating a dialogue that was gentle, respectful, and surprisingly intimate, given the circumstances. Outside, the snow continued to drift, coating the world in silence. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the simple act of conversation created a bubble of safety and connection. Time seemed to slow, and the harsh winter night no longer felt as threatening. By the time the clock approached midnight, the neighbor had begun to relax fully. Her shivering had stopped, her breathing was steady, and the tension that had gripped her body earlier had loosened. The protagonist could see a trace of a smile on her face, small but genuine. It was the smile of someone who had survived a frightening ordeal, who had been seen and helped without judgment, and who had found comfort in unexpected companionship. He knew the night was far from over. The cold outside was relentless, and she was still vulnerable. But for now, the immediate danger had passed, and in that moment, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the simplest acts of kindness, offering warmth, a cup of tea, or simply listening, could create a connection that saved more than just a body. It could save a spirit. As they sat together, the quiet of the house wrapping around them like a protective blanket, the protagonist understood that this night would leave a lasting impression on both of them. The neighbor had opened a small window into her world, and he had responded with care and compassion. It was a reminder that human connection, even in its most subtle forms, could bring light to the darkest and coldest nights. And so, in that modest living room, amid the snow, wind, and chill of winter, two lives intertwined in a moment of shared humanity. One had reached out with concern and courage, and the other had allowed herself to receive it. It was a fragile bond, but one that would linger in their hearts far longer than the cold of the night outside. The wind outside had not eased, and the snow continued to fall in thick, silent layers. Inside the modest house, the warmth of the fire provided a fragile comfort, but it could not completely erase the cold that had seeped into bones and hearts alike. The protagonist moved around quietly, checking that everything was in place for his neighbor's safety. More blankets, extra pillows, a tray of warm tea, and a few snacks he had quickly gathered. She sat quietly in her chair, wrapped in layers, her hands now less shaky, and her breathing slow and steady. He could see that the exhaustion of the evening was catching up to her. The shivering had stopped, but her body still trembled slightly whenever she shifted. The heat from the fire helped, but it would take more than just blankets to fully warm someone who had spent hours outside in the bitter cold. "You need to rest," he said softly, kneeling beside the chair. "You've been through a lot tonight." She looked at him, a mixture of pride and fatigue in her eyes. I suppose so," she admitted. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was no argument this time. The events of the evening had left her too tired to resist the suggestion of care. He hesitated, unsure how to phrase what he needed to say next. The house had only one bedroom that was truly warm enough, and the living room, though cozy, wasn't ideal for a long rest. He realized that the only way to make her fully comfortable was to offer her the bed. It was a delicate situation. He did not want to offend her, but he could not ignore the practical need. "I have an idea," he said carefully, choosing his words. "There's a bed in the bedroom that's warmer. You could lie down there tonight. I'll sleep elsewhere. It's just for tonight, to make sure you're safe and warm." She froze for a moment, caught between instinct and pride. Her eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head. I couldn't," she said softly. "I can manage here." "You don't have to," he said quickly. "If you really want. But I think it's the safest thing tonight. Just to make sure you're fully warmed and rested. I promise. I'll be fine on the couch. I just want you to be safe." There was a long pause. He watched her carefully, sensing the internal struggle she faced. Pride was a strong force in her life, shaped by decades of independence and resilience. But survival and comfort were stronger forces tonight. Slowly, she nodded. "All right. Just for tonight," she murmured, a small gesture of trust. He smiled gently and helped her rise from the chair. Her movements were cautious, deliberate, but she managed with his support. He guided her to the bedroom, where the fire's warmth did not reach directly, but the blankets and the soft mattress made it inviting. She carefully settled into the bed, pulling the layers up to her chin. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, adjusting a pillow behind her head. She nodded, closing her eyes briefly. "Yes. Thank you," she whispered. There was a quiet relief in her voice, a rare moment of vulnerability that he felt honored to witness. He paused at the door, considering what to do next. The house was quiet now, filled with the faint crackle of the dying fire and the soft rhythm of her breathing. He returned to the living room, settling onto the couch with a blanket, careful to make himself comfortable while giving her space. Despite the exhaustion of the day, sleep did not come easily. He found himself glancing toward the bedroom door, worried that she might still be cold or uncomfortable. After a few minutes, he noticed the faint sound of movement. The neighbor was adjusting herself under the blankets, seeking warmth and comfort. It reminded him that even small gestures of care could bring a sense of security that went beyond words. He thought about the events of the evening, reflecting on how a simple act of noticing a flickering light had led to this moment. Life often had a way of testing people in unexpected ways, he realized, and sometimes the most meaningful connections formed under the most unusual circumstances. Tonight had been a test of trust, resilience, and compassion, and both of them had responded with care and humility. Eventually, exhaustion took its toll, and he drifted into a light sleep, though it was punctuated by moments of wakefulness. Each time he stirred, he would check the bedroom briefly, reassured to see her safe, wrapped in warmth and blankets. She had fallen asleep, her breathing steady, a small, peaceful expression on her face that belied the difficulties of the day. Hours passed. The wind outside continued its relentless howl, shaking the windows and creating an almost constant background noise. Inside, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was dim but safe. The neighbor shifted in the bed, murmuring softly in her sleep, and he realized that she was finally letting herself rest after what had been a long and frightening evening. When he woke briefly to check the fire, he noticed the frost beginning to form on the windows, a reminder of the harshness of winter outside. It made him even more grateful that she had accepted his offer of warmth and shelter. A small smile appeared on his face. It was strange, he thought, how quickly fear and isolation could give way to trust and connection when someone simply showed they cared. He reflected on the stories she had shared, the memories of her husband, her life on the reservation, the challenges she had endured. They were more than stories, they were lessons, moments of history carried in a single life. Listening to her had been like opening a window into a world he had never fully known, a world shaped by strength, tradition, and quiet endurance. As the night deepened, he noticed something subtle but significant. Her breathing had grown even more relaxed, and her body seemed to sink further into the mattress, finally safe from the cold that had threatened her just hours earlier. The simple act of offering warmth, a safe space, and company had transformed fear into peace. It was a powerful reminder that kindness and care could bridge even the widest gaps of pride and solitude. He thought about the future. Tonight was only one night, but it could mark the beginning of a change. Perhaps she would begin to accept help more often, to share her life a little more openly with those around her. He hoped so. And he knew that, in turn, he had learned something too: the importance of noticing, of acting, and of being present when someone needed you most. The house remained quiet for the rest of the night. The only sounds were the faint creak of the floorboards, the distant howl of the wind, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the neighbor asleep in the bed. He sat on the couch, listening, reflecting, and feeling a deep sense of connection that was rare and precious. Eventually, sleep came more fully. When he closed his eyes, he dreamt not of fear or cold, but of warmth and shared stories, of small gestures that had brought comfort, and of a fragile bond growing stronger in the most unlikely of circumstances. He dreamt of trust, resilience, and the quiet power of human kindness. Morning would come soon, bringing with it the promise of a new day and the continuation of lives touched by compassion. But tonight, in the stillness of the winter storm and the quiet warmth of a small house, two souls had found comfort and safety in one another's presence. One had reached out with care, the other had accepted it, and together, they had faced the night with courage and grace. The protagonist felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had discovered not just the immediate need to save someone from the cold, but also the deeper truth that connection, empathy, and trust could transform fear into peace. And he knew, even as he drifted further into sleep, that this night would remain with him forever, not for its dangers, but for the warmth of shared humanity that had shone brighter than any fire could. The first light of morning filtered softly through the frost-covered windows, casting a gentle glow across the room. The snow outside had settled into a smooth, white blanket, muffling the sounds of the world and making everything feel quiet and still. Inside the modest house, warmth from the fire and the blanket still lingered, creating a cozy, protective bubble around the protagonist and his neighbor. He stirred gently on the couch, careful not to wake her. The night had been long and full of small, intense moments. But now, in the calm of morning, he could finally breathe and reflect on what had happened. The neighbor lay in the bed, asleep still, her breathing deep and steady. The exhaustion from the previous night had left her peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, it seemed she could rest without fear or discomfort. He quietly moved to the kitchen to prepare a small breakfast, not wanting to disturb the serenity of the morning. The aroma of coffee and toast soon filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of sage that still lingered from the previous evening. As he arranged the plates and cups, he thought about how fragile life could be, and how a simple act of kindness could make a profound difference. Returning to the bedroom, he knocked softly on the door. "Good morning," he said gently. "I've made some breakfast. Are you awake?" The neighbor stirred, blinking sleepily at the light streaming through the window. Her hair was slightly tousled, and there was a softness in her expression that had not been there the night before. "Good morning," she replied quietly, her voice still carrying the faint rasp of sleep. She glanced at him, and for a moment, her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and quiet acknowledgement of the trust they had built. He smiled gently. "I hope you slept well. You needed it after last night." She nodded slowly. "Yes, more than I realized," she admitted. Her voice was calm, without the hesitation or resistance she had shown earlier. It was a small, but meaningful change. The events of the previous night had created a bridge between them, a fragile connection forged from care, trust, and the shared experience of facing the cold together. As they sat down to breakfast, there was a comfortable silence between them. The wind outside continued to whisper through the trees, but inside, the warmth and quiet made it feel safe and calm. The protagonist noticed the small gestures that indicated her comfort. She reached for the toast without hesitation, held the coffee cup in her hands, and even offered him a small smile that he had not seen before. "You know," he said softly, breaking the silence, "tonight could have gone very differently if I hadn't noticed the light flickering." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know. I didn't realize how weak I'd become," she said quietly. "I thought I could handle it. But I'm glad you were there." Her words were simple, but they carried a depth of emotion that went beyond mere gratitude. There was relief, recognition, and a growing sense of trust that she had allowed herself to feel. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand near hers on the table. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said gently. "It's okay to let someone help sometimes. That doesn't make you weak." For a long moment, she was silent, considering his words. Then, with a faint but genuine smile, she nodded. "I suppose, maybe I can learn that," she said softly. It was a tentative acknowledgement, but it marked a turning point. For someone who had lived decades, valuing independence and pride, this small concession was a significant step. They ate their breakfast slowly, sharing small stories and reflections. She talked about the routines she had maintained since her husband's passing, the ways she had stayed connected to her heritage, and the memories that shaped her life. He listened attentively, asking gentle questions, offering quiet encouragement, and responding with interest and respect. The conversation was easy, natural, and for the first time, he saw her not as the distant neighbor he had known from afar, but as a person with a rich history, profound resilience, and quiet warmth. The shared experience of the previous night had created a foundation of trust that allowed her to open up in a way she rarely did. After breakfast, he helped her gather some warm clothing and ensured she had everything she needed to stay comfortable for the rest of the day. The snow outside made the idea of venturing out unappealing, so they remained indoors, moving carefully around the small house, tidying and arranging blankets, and preparing more tea. These small acts of care, though simple, reinforced the sense of safety and connection that had begun the night before. As the morning turned into early afternoon, he realized that this experience had changed both of them. For her, it was a reminder that accepting help did not diminish her strength or independence, it allowed her to preserve it. For him, it was a realization that kindness, attentiveness, and compassion could create bonds that were far more meaningful than casual greetings or distant neighborly exchanges. They spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories, and even laughing softly at small anecdotes from their lives. The neighbor recounted moments from her youth, tales of her husband's humor, and stories of the traditions that had guided her family for generations. He shared memories of his own childhood, the simple joys and challenges of growing up in a small town, and the lessons he had learned along the way. The more they talked, the more he understood the depth of her experience and the quiet strength that had carried her through decades of hardship. In return, she gained a companion, someone who listened without judgment, respected her independence, and offered support when it was needed most. It was a subtle, yet profound shift in their relationship, a bridge between solitude and shared humanity. By late afternoon, the snow outside had stopped completely, leaving the world covered in a soft, sparkling layer. The sunlight reflected off the pristine snow, creating a sense of calm and renewal. Inside, the warmth of the house, the lingering fire, and the shared experience of the past night created an atmosphere of safety, comfort, and quiet contentment. The protagonist realized that he wanted to ensure she had the support she needed moving forward. He gently suggested that she keep extra blankets, tea, and hot water close at hand, and that she should feel free to reach out if she ever needed help. She listened, nodding slowly, and for the first time, he felt that she truly understood the meaning of trust and community. As the day drew to a close, he prepared to leave, knowing that she was safe, warm, and comfortable. She walked him to the door, her movements steady and assured. The wind outside was crisp, but no longer threatening, and the snow sparkled under the fading sunlight. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his with sincerity. "For everything. Last night, it meant more than I can say." He smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're safe." For a moment, they stood in quiet acknowledgement. Two neighbors whose lives had intersected in a moment of vulnerability, courage, and care. The trust they had built in such a short time was rare and valuable, a reminder that human connection could emerge in even the most unexpected circumstances. As he walked back to his own home, he reflected on the lessons of the past night. Life could be fragile and unpredictable, but moments of compassion, empathy, and kindness had the power to transform fear into safety, loneliness into connection, and cold into warmth. He realized that these small, meaningful gestures often left a deeper mark than any grand achievement or distant act of charity. For her part, she returned to her chair, now comfortable and warm, reflecting on the unexpected bond that had formed. She had faced the harshness of winter alone, and yet, through the simple act of accepting help, and that vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The experience left both of them changed. The protagonist had gained a deeper understanding of resilience, independence, and the quiet ways people protect themselves. She had gained the reassurance that she was not alone, that help and companionship could exist without diminishing her dignity. Together, they had navigated the uncertainty of the night and emerged with a renewed sense of trust, humanity, and quiet joy. As evening fell, the house was filled with a gentle warmth, both from the fire and the newfound connection between neighbors. Outside, the world remained blanketed in snow, silent and still. Inside, the room echoed with the soft comfort of shared experience, understanding, and respect. And in that small, modest home, amid the lingering chill of winter and the fading light of day, a quiet transformation had taken place. Two lives had intersected in a moment of need, and the bond they had forged would linger long after the snow had melted, long after the wind had ceased, as a testament to the power of kindness, trust, and the enduring strength of human connection. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, warmth could be found not just in fire or blankets, but in the care, understanding, and presence of another person. And for both of them, that warmth would remain, quietly shining through the days to come, a symbol of hope, trust, and the enduring strength of compassion.